In the Wild Horse Desert of South Texas, a brand called the Running W is burned into the land itself. 825,000 acres of it, 1,289 sections of range, an area larger than the state of Rhode Island, under a single family's name. The original ground cost 3 cents per acre. The first 15,500 acres, 24 sections, cost $300. Purchased from a Mexican family who held the grant from the Crown of Spain and had nowhere else to go. The man who bought it arrived in New York Harbor with nothing. He stowed away on a ship at 11 years old. He ran Confederate cotton through a Union blockade under a fraudulent flag. He rode into a drought-stricken Mexican village, bought every cow the people owned, then turned around and offered them jobs. This is the story of Richard King, steamboat captain, smuggler, cattleman. The man who built an empire at the southern edge of America and called it a ranch. And the question his story forces open: did Richard King build something from nothing, or did he build something from everything other people had left? Chapter 1. The Stowaway. Richard King arrived in the world without advantages. His parents were Irish immigrants who died when he was 5. Their names were not recorded. Not then, not later, not in any history of the empire he would build. For 4 years after their deaths, his aunt kept him in Orange County, New York. Then she apprenticed him to a jeweler in Manhattan. He was 9 years old. The arrangement was legal, documented, and a form of servitude. He would work for the jeweler. He would earn no wages worth noting. He would babysit the jeweler's children in addition to his other duties. This was his future. He lasted 4 years. In 1835, 11-year-old Richard King walked down to the wharves of Lower Manhattan and found a ship heading south. The vessel was called the Desdemona, bound for Mobile, Alabama. King hid below deck. When the crew found him 3 days into the voyage, he expected the worst. What he got instead was a job. The captain put him to work as a cabin boy and kept him on for the remainder of the passage. Something about the boy's willingness, or the impracticality of putting him overboard, made him useful rather than a problem. He would not return to New York. He would not return to the jeweler. He had made a calculation that most 11-year-olds don't make, that the future ahead of him was worse than any risk the ship could offer. What met him in Mobile was the steamboat trade. Captain Hugh Monroe took King on, and after Monroe, Captain Joe Holland, who ran the Alabama River route between Montgomery and Mobile. The Alabama River trade in the 1830s and 1840s was not a gentle occupation. The steamboats of that era operated on wooden hulls over boilers that frequently exploded, on rivers that flooded in spring and ran nearly dry in fall, carrying freight of every description between cotton country and the coast. The vessels themselves were barely regulated. A pilot needed to know every snag, every sandbar, every bend where the current ran deceptive. The mortality rate among deckhands and firemen was significant. Among pilots, it was lower. Pilots were too valuable to replace easily, and a good one knew when to stop. The boats averaged 150 feet in length and 30 feet of beam. They drew 4 feet of water when loaded, less when empty. A full load of cotton bales, 300 bales, was common, 500 possible on the larger vessels, weighed between 150 and 250,000 pounds. The firemen who fed the boilers worked in 4-hour rotations, shoveling wood or coal into furnaces that ran day and night. Deckhands earned $8 per month. Pilots earned between $40 and $75 per month at the journeyman level, 4 times the wage of a common laborer. Captains' wages ran to $125 on the busier routes. The boats that ran the Alabama River carried cotton south and manufactured goods north, and the men who ran them ran the economic artery of the Deep South. By 16, Richard King was a pilot. Not a pilot's assistant, not an apprentice, a licensed pilot. This was an era when the river trade was one of the few American industries that would advance a man on demonstrated skill rather than family connection or formal credential. King had no family connection. He had no credential beyond the 8 months in Connecticut. What he had was an ability to read water that his employers found valuable enough to promote ahead of schedule. Joe Holland offered King something unusual. For 8 months, the captain enrolled him in school in Connecticut alongside Holland's own children. King ate at the family table. He slept under a proper roof. He attended a one-room schoolhouse and learned to read beyond the functional level a river pilot required. He was, for those 8 months, treated as something approximating a member of a family, not a servant, not hired help, not an apprentice whose labor was owed. A boy with a seat at the table. He went back to the river. This is the detail that clarifies everything that follows. Not the stowing away, not the precocious piloting, not the money he would make, or the land he would accumulate. The fact that he was shown warmth, genuine and unearned, and returned to the water anyway. Some men chase comfort once they've tasted it. King catalogued it and moved on. The river was not a consolation for a life he couldn't have. It was the life he wanted, and no Connecticut schoolroom was going to alter that preference. He spent his early 20s on the Apalachicola and Chattahoochee rivers in Florida and Georgia. The Second Seminole War brought Army contracts, and with the Army contracts came a different class of employer, one that paid on time and in full. It was on an Army steamer in 1842 that King met a man 7 years his senior, a Quaker from Pennsylvania who had come to Florida on a military commission and could throw a ship's anchor overboard by himself, a task that normally required 3 men. The man's name was Mifflin Kennedy. In the years between King's arrival in Mobile and his meeting with Kennedy, something had been established that no schooling could have provided. He understood how freight moved. He understood the people who needed it moved, and what they would pay, and what they would do when the price was right. He understood how contracts worked, and how they could be structured to favor the man holding the pen. He had no money, no land, no name anyone recognized south of Albany. He had the river, and in 1846, a war would put him on a different one. Chapter 2. The River That Made Him. Mifflin Kennedy wrote King a letter in 1846. The Mexican-American War had opened the Rio Grande. The Army needed steamboats and pilots who could run a shallow, winding river that no standard Gulf vessel was built for. The pay was government guaranteed. The opportunity was immediate. For Richard King, who had no family, no money, and no roots anywhere, that was enough. He arrived on the Rio Grande to captain the Colonel Cross, an Army transport hauling men and supplies between Reynosa, Camargo, and Matamoros for General Zachary Taylor. The work was difficult in the way river work always was. The Rio Grande ran narrow in places, choked with snags, subject to flooding and drought in alternating seasons, its channel shifting unpredictably through the brush country of the borderlands. What distinguished it from the Alabama and Apalachicola was the volume of military need. The Army required everything: food, ammunition, horses, medicine, mail, officers, dispatches. The river was the supply line, and the line ran through whoever controlled the boats. The war ended in 1848. King bought a surplus Army steamboat and stayed. This was not an obvious decision. Most of the pilots and operators who had come down with the war effort left when the contracts dried up. The Rio Grande was not a comfortable place to build a peacetime business. The border was contested in ways that went beyond legal dispute. Mexican raiders crossed regularly, bandit operations ran both directions, and the nominal authority of any government thinned quickly once you were more than a few miles from Brownsville or Matamoros. A man who had no particular attachment to the region had reason enough to take his capital and move somewhere more settled. King had no particular attachment to anywhere. That was the advantage. In 1850, he and Kennedy formalized their partnership along with two other investors, creating M. Kennedy and Company. The structure was clear. Kennedy contributed diplomacy and management, King contributed muscle and mechanical ingenuity, and their senior partner, Charles Stillman, contributed capital. King designed new boats specifically built for the river's constraints, reinforced hulls for the grounding risks, shallow drafts that could navigate during low water seasons, agile steering for the meandering channels. By the mid-1850s, the firm had done what monopolies always do when given enough time and enough capital. It had run its competitors off the river. The Texas Monthly account of that period is direct. There was a good deal of legitimate freight in their business, but their primary trade was smuggling. A burdensome Mexican tariff system had made moving goods across the border through official channels expensive to the point of absurdity. Smuggling was not a fringe operation in the lower Rio Grande Valley. It was the accepted way of conducting commerce, as normal as the tariff itself was abnormal. King and Kennedy did not invent the system. They scaled it. By the mid-1850s, the firm's operations stretched over 500 miles of river inland, far beyond what standard Gulf steamboats could navigate. Their fleet included purpose-built sternwheelers, the Grampus, the Comanche, and several others commissioned to specification. The largest vessels ran 160 feet in length and 35 feet of beam, drawing 3 feet of water fully loaded. During peak season, dozens of boats operated simultaneously. They hauled cotton, wool, provisions, and merchandise southbound, manufactured goods, military surplus, and whatever paid the tariff on the northbound run. Annual freight volume reached figures the firm did not publish and had reason not to. Revenues at the peak of the monopoly's operation ran into the tens of thousands of dollars per year per vessel. Passenger traffic added to the ledger. Merchants, emigrants, military officers, and government agents all needed to move on the river, and M. Kennedy and Company was the only practical way to do it. The partnership employed crew in shifts, pilots at $50 to $60 per month, engineers at similar wages, deckhands at $8 to $10. A fully staffed vessel required between 12 and 20 men, rotating through duties that ran around the clock. This was the capital that would buy the land, not savings from honest wages, not inheritance. Monopoly river profits, built partly on moving goods that Mexico was not supposed to receive without paying the tariff, and that crossed the border under whatever legal cover was convenient. Every acre of the ranch that came later, every Spanish land grant, every distress purchase from a drought-strapped family, every mile of fence was funded by what the river produced in those years. King understood something about capital that most people learn too late. Boats depreciate, water corrodes hulls, boilers explode, vessels wreck on sandbars, and the investment vanishes in an afternoon. He had watched this happen to other men on the Alabama. A boat was a machine that fought you for its value from the day you commissioned it. Land was different. Land and livestock have a way of increasing in value, he told Kennedy. Cattle and horses, sheep and goats will reproduce themselves into value. But boats, they have a way of wrecking, decaying, falling apart, decreasing in value, and increasing in cost of operation. Robert E. Lee, stationed in Texas during those years, offered the same advice more simply, buy land and never sell. King was already thinking the same thing. In 1852, he made the overland journey from Brownsville to Corpus Christi for a Lone Star World's Fair, and he saw something that settled the question permanently. Miles of sand flats and seas of grass stretching north of what would one day become Raymondville, the Great Plains, southern edge, unbroken to the horizon, no fences, no towns, no railroads, just grass, and a sky that went on without interruption, and land that nobody with money was paying attention to. He paid attention. He had the river, the capital, and now a destination for it. What happened next was not complicated. It was a series of transactions, each smaller than the one before, adding up to something that had no name yet for what it was becoming. Chapter 3. The Grasslands at 2 cents an acre. The Nueces Strip was contested ground. Between the Nueces River to the north and the Rio Grande to the south lay a triangle of borderland that Mexico believed was still Mexico, and the United States believed it had won in the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had settled the question on paper in 1848. On the ground, it remained unsettled in ways that paper rarely resolved. Ranchers who had held Spanish land grants for 3 generations found their titles suddenly subject to American courts they couldn't access in a language most of them didn't speak. The legal apparatus that would adjudicate their claims had been built by and for the people doing the adjudicating. Into this landscape, in the spring of 1852, Richard King rode north from Brownsville toward Corpus Christi. The invitation was a Lone Star World's Fair organized by Henry Lawrence Kinney, the founder of Corpus Christi. King had been working the Rio Grande for 5 years. He had money he needed to put somewhere better than a boat. The overland ride north gave him something he hadn't planned on: 2 days across a country that nobody with capital was looking at seriously. What he saw was grass, miles of it, the coastal prairie rolling north without interruption, the same mesquite and huizach that lined the creek bottoms, the salt grass flats giving way to taller bluestem as the ground rose. No fences, no towns, no railroads, no survey markers, nothing to indicate that anyone considered this land worth organizing. The summer heat was oppressive in the way that South Texas heat always is, not just warm but physical, something that leans on you. The humidity came off the Gulf and never quite left. A man from Rhode Island, or from Alabama, or from the banks of the Rio Grande might have looked at that country and seen obstacle. King looked at it and saw infrastructure waiting to be built. A Texas Ranger named Gideon Legs Lewis rode with him into Corpus Christi. Lewis was long-limbed, well-connected in South Texas, and understood the borderlands in ways that King, still relatively new to the region, did not. Lewis proposed a partnership. King would provide the capital. Lewis would provide the expertise and protection. They would establish a cow camp on the grasslands. King agreed. The land market in the Nueces Strip in the early 1850s operated on a logic that was straightforward, once you understood who had leverage and who didn't. The Spanish and Mexican land grant families who held title to much of the ground were in a difficult position. Their grants predated American sovereignty. Their legal standing in the new courts was uncertain at best. They were navigating a system built in English, administered by Anglo judges, enforced by Texas Rangers, who generally represented Anglo interests. Many of them were also facing a practical problem that had nothing to do with courts. The Wild Horse Desert was a dangerous place to ranch without the resources to defend it. Comanche raiders still crossed from the north. Mexican bandits crossed from the south. A family with a paper title and no armed workforce was vulnerable in ways that made the title nearly theoretical. The prices reflected all of this. In 1853, King purchased the Rincon de Santa Gertrudis from the heirs of Juan Mendiola. The grant traced to an 1834 authorization from the state of Tamaulipas under Mexican sovereignty. It covered 15,500 acres, 24 sections, where Santa Gertrudis Creek emptied toward what would one day be called Baffin Bay. The purchase price was $300, about $11,000 in today's money, less than 2 cents per acre. The following year, King bought the adjacent Santa Gertrudis de la Garza grant from José Pérez Rey, whose title ran to an 1808 grant from the Crown of Spain. 53,000 acres, 83 sections, $1,800, roughly $66,000 today, a bit over 3 cents per acre. Between his first and second purchase, he was swindled. He paid an asking price for what he was told was a claim to the southern half of Padre Island, a long barrier island off the Gulf Coast that would one day be a national seashore. The title was fraudulent. The claim was worthless. King lost the money and learned the one lesson he apparently needed to learn only once: get better lawyers. He found them in Corpus Christi. His instructions were simple: verify every title, survey every boundary, make the paperwork strong enough to survive challenge in an American court. From that point forward, every land transaction King made ran through legal counsel first. Every title was examined. Every boundary was verified. Over the following 3 decades, he would make more than 60 major land purchases. Almost none of them would be successfully challenged. The 2 purchases of 1853 and 54 gave him 68,500 acres, 107 sections, for a combined total of $2,100. The land would not have been cheap even at that price if it had been genuinely secure, which it was not yet. It was cheap because King was buying risk that the sellers could no longer afford to carry, and he could. He had the river operation behind him. He had lawyers. He had cash. He had a plan for what the land could become that its current owners, exhausted and legally disadvantaged, did not have the resources to execute. Robert E. Lee's advice about buying land and never selling was, by the time King heard it, something he was already doing. Lee was confirming a decision already made. What these 2 parcels would become was not yet clear even to King. He needed cattle, water, and workers. He had the land and the capital and the will. The other 3 were problems to be solved in sequence. The water problem would take 50 more years and a German-American lawyer to resolve. The cattle problem would be solved with a trail drive and some longhorns nobody else wanted. The workers would come from a drought and from a calculation that a certain steamboat captain made on the back of a horse, 2 days south of the Rio Grande. He came from Rhode Island. He came from a jeweler's indenture and an Alabama river and a war. He came with river money that no one would trace back to what it actually was. He had 68,500 acres, 107 sections, and a partner who would be dead within a year. Chapter 4. Henrietta. In early 1855, 4 months after King's wedding, Gideon Lewis was shot and killed by a jealous husband. King's first ranch partner, the man who knew the borderlands, who had the ranger connections, who understood South Texas in ways a steamboat captain from New York did not, was gone. King bought out his share. He was now alone on 68,000 acres, 107 sections of contested ground, with cattle he was still learning to manage, a new wife, and country that would kill the unprepared without ceremony. What he had, as it turned out, was Henrietta. She was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister who had come to Brownsville from the north, and she had grown up in a border town built almost entirely on war and commerce and the uncertain business of being a place where two countries met and frequently disputed the meeting. By the standards of mid-century Brownsville, Henrietta Chamberlain was refined. She was educated. She spoke and dressed and organized her household in ways that signaled a different world than the one immediately outside the door. Richard King met her sometime after his arrival on the Rio Grande. The exact circumstances are not precisely recorded. What is recorded is the outcome. On December 10th, 1854, at Brownsville, they were married. King was 30 years old. Henrietta was 22. He was a steamboat captain who had never attended school past age 11, whose primary business included significant portions of smuggled goods, whose two major land purchases had been made from Mexican families with no leverage to negotiate. She was the daughter of a man who had educated her and expected her to enter the world with the tools to navigate it. What she agreed to, in practical terms, was this: a frame house in the Wild Horse Desert, 50 miles from Corpus Christi, in country that was still under genuine threat from Comanche raiders to the north and Mexican bandits who crossed the Rio Grande with some regularity. The nearest town of any consequence was a half-day's ride in good weather. Supply runs were occasions, not errands. The heat was constant from April through October. The mosquitoes off the coastal marshes were not metaphorical. Henrietta was informed of all of this before the wedding. She came anyway. She would later be described, and not inaccurately, as the civilizing force behind everything King built. This was true in a literal sense. She provided the architecture of daily life that a steamboat captain and former stowaway had no experience constructing. Housing for the ranch workers and their families fell under her management. Health care, such as it was in South Texas in the 1850s, came from her kitchen and her knowledge. The children of the workers attended a school that existed because she organized it. When guests arrived at Santa Gertrudis, which they did with some frequency once King's reputation warranted it, they encountered hospitality that bordered on the surprising, given the remoteness of the location. Coffee and cakes at midnight for a lawyer arriving by buckboard in the dark. That was Henrietta. The ranch house itself was built in the Mexican hacienda style, thick-walled, courtyard-centered, designed for heat and for defense simultaneously. The walls were lime-plastered brick, 2 feet thick in the main sections, offering some resistance to both the summer temperature and the occasional rifle shot from outside. The covered verandas ran along the front and sides, creating shaded exterior space that functioned as an extension of the living quarters. The house was not large by later standards, not the big house it would eventually become, but it was built to be permanent in a way that most structures on the frontier were not. Permanent wood floors, real window glass, a kitchen that served both family and, on many occasions, the extended population of the growing ranch compound. What Henrietta understood, and what the historical record is somewhat reluctant to foreground, is that she managed a population while King managed a business. The workers who lived on Santa Gertrudis in those early years, the vaqueros, the ranch hands, the families that accumulated around the operation, needed someone to organize the terms of daily life. Medical decisions, housing allocation, food supply, school operation. These fell to her as a matter of operational necessity, not sentiment. King was frequently absent on the river. When he was there, he was thinking about the next land purchase, the next cattle deal, the next legal matter. Henrietta ran what the ranch actually was on any given day, a small settlement of people who had organized their lives around a single employer in country that offered no alternative within reasonable travel. 5 children came in the years that followed. The first, Nettie, in 1856, then Ella, Richard Jr., Lee, and finally Alice Gertrudis, named for the creek that ran through the property, born in 1862 and destined to be the last king standing when the century was done. Through all of it, Henrietta's position was defined by something beyond her formal role as wife. She was the one who stayed. When the ranch needed to be defended, she was at the ranch. When the children needed to be fed during the war, she fed them. When the social contract with the workers needed to be maintained during King's extended absences on the cotton road or the river, she maintained it. She was not a symbol of refinement placed against a rough landscape. She was a functioning part of the operation, the component that kept it from becoming purely extractive in the way that all male frontier enterprises tended to become. Then the war came. Not the war she'd heard about from her father's pulpit. The war that would make Richard King richer than the river ever had, and nearly get him killed. Chapter 5. The Village He Purchased. The drought hit Tamaulipas in the early 1850s and did what drought always does to cattle country. It dried the grass, thinned the animals, and forced every ranching family to the same calculation: sell now for something, or wait and sell for nothing. The village of Cruillas sat in the high desert scrub of northeastern Mexico, about 100 miles south of the Rio Grande. Its people had ranched that ground for generations. They were expert horsemen, skilled with cattle in the way that the Mexican vaquero tradition had developed over 2 centuries, reading animal behavior, working livestock on horseback, handling the management of a herd with a fluency that most Anglo ranchers in South Texas had not yet acquired. When the drought came, their cattle began to suffer. Richard King came with money. He bought their animals, the whole herd, or close enough to it that the distinction made no practical difference. He paid whatever the drought price was. The transaction was legal. The sellers had agreed. King loaded the cattle and pointed them north toward the Rio Grande and Santa Gertrudis. He got a short distance out of town before he stopped. King realized, riding north with their cattle, that he had solved an immediate problem for the people of Cruillas while simultaneously removing their long-term means of livelihood. He turned back. He made them a proposition: food, shelter, and wages in exchange for coming to work on the ranch. The villagers conferred. Many accepted. They drove north with him into Texas and became the founding population of what would be called Los Kineños, the King's people. He had just purchased the thing that made Cruillas economically viable. He was now in a position to offer employment to people he had made economically dependent. The alternative to accepting, staying in a drought-struck village without cattle, in a country that offered limited options for skilled ranch labor, was not attractive. He recognized the problem he had created. He was also the one who had created it. What the vaqueros of Cruillas brought to Santa Gertrudis was not supplementary labor. It was the entire operational foundation of the ranch. King was a steamboat captain. He could read a river, negotiate a contract, and move goods across contested terrain. He had not spent his life learning how to work cattle at scale in South Texas brush country. The Kineños had. They broke and trained the horses. They managed the roundups. They rode the line camps and checked the fences and knew which waterholes ran dry first and which held through August. They branded the calves and drove the herds and maintained the infrastructure of an operation that would eventually cover territory measured not in sections, the standard Texas unit of 640 acres, 1 square mile, what a working cowboy could ride across in a long morning, but in counties. The expert stockmen from Cruillas were not employees supplementing a working ranch. They were the people who made it possible for a ranch to exist at all. By the mid-1860s, the Santa Gertrudis employed between 40 and 60 vaqueros full-time, most of them Kineños or their relatives. 8-line camps were distributed across the territory, each housing between 4 and 8 men with a remuda of horses. The camp nearest the headquarters ran 20 horses per rider. Outer camps, where men stayed for weeks at a stretch, kept 30. Supply wagons ran from the main compound to the camps on a rotating schedule. The working horse population of the ranch exceeded 500 head. Roundup operations required a minimum of 4 crews working simultaneously to cover the range, with each crew responsible for sections that took days to cross on horseback. The branded calf count in a single season ran to the thousands. A rough accounting of what it required to run the Santa Gertrudis at that scale meant feeding, housing, and equipping roughly 150 people, including families, on a permanent basis. King built housing for the Kineños and their families on the ranch compound. A school operated for the children. Henrietta managed the health care. The company supplied provisions through a store attached to the headquarters. The wages were real, not symbolic, but the structure of life on Santa Gertrudis created a gravitational pull that was stronger than wages alone. Your family was here. Your neighbors were here. The nearest alternative employment was 50 miles away across brush country in a language and legal system that had not historically served Mexican workers well. The ranch provided everything it provided on the condition of continued presence, and the cost of leaving was not just a job, but an entire world. Whether you call this paternalism or something harder depends on what you emphasize. The food was real. The housing was real. The wages, such as they were paid. The Kineños were not enslaved in any formal sense. They were also not free in any practical sense. The economic architecture of the arrangement, food, shelter, and employment provided by the same person on the same property with no viable outside option, is a specific kind of structure that has a specific name. It had been operating under Spanish authority in Mexico for 2 centuries before King arrived. He didn't invent the hacienda system. He imported it, in human form, from the village whose cattle he had purchased on the way out of Tamaulipas. Their descendants still live and work on the ranch. Generations of Kineños, whose great-grandparents made the journey north with King's cattle, who grew up inside the same compound, who built the expertise that every subsequent King Ranch operation depended upon. The King Ranch calls them indispensable. They were. The question of what they were owed for that indispensability is one the historical record leaves largely unanswered. The drought passed, the cattle multiplied, and a war was coming that would make everything before it look like practice. Chapter 6. The Cotton Road. Texas seceded from the Union on March 2, 1861. Richard King's position was not complicated by ideology. The Confederacy controlled the territory where he had built his business. The Cotton Road ran through his land. His river operation moved goods that the Confederate economy depended on. He chose the side that made the most commercial sense, and he supplied it thoroughly. Beef, horses, imported munitions, medical supplies, clothing, shoes. The Confederate government contracted with him for all of it. King contracted back. The financial architecture of what followed was elegant in the way that good smuggling always is. The Union Navy had established a blockade of Confederate ports along the Gulf Coast. Cotton was the Confederacy's primary export and its primary source of hard currency from European buyers. Without hard currency, the Confederate war effort was running on credit it couldn't redeem. King and Kennedy re-registered their steamboat interests under Mexican flag and moved their operations out of Brownsville into Matamoros, across the river. Legally, their vessels were now Mexican ships, conducting legitimate international trade. The cotton crossed the river, loaded onto their boats, and floated south to Baghdad at the mouth of the Rio Grande, where it transferred to ocean vessels bound for European textile mills. The military supplies came back the same way. The Union Navy couldn't touch a Mexican-flagged vessel in international waters. The Union Army, when it eventually reached the border, was operating on land where King had more connections than they did. For 3 years, the Cotton Road moved Confederate wealth through South Texas and into the global market, and King sat at the center of it. The revenues were not published. They didn't need to be. Earned considerable fortunes is how the historical record describes it, which is the kind of phrase that earns its understatement. Then came December 23, 1863. Union troops under Captain James Speed had captured Brownsville. 80 men rode out from town toward Santa Gertrudis. Someone warned King before they arrived, who exactly is not recorded. He fled, leaving behind his pregnant wife, their children, and the ranch compound they had spent 9 years building. Henrietta did not flee. A ranch hand named Francisco Alvarado saw the soldiers approaching the house. He went out to warn them, to tell them that women and children were inside and that they were firing toward a domestic compound, not a military position. The soldiers shot him. He died at the entrance to the house he had worked to defend. The troops searched every building for King. They didn't find him. They vandalized the house, took ranch hands prisoner, and left. Henrietta moved the family to San Antonio until it was safe to return. King spent the remainder of the war in Matamoros, running cotton, waiting for amnesty from President Johnson. He applied in writing, received it, and returned to Texas on July 14, 1865. What he came back to was a damaged ranch and a very large amount of money. The war had been profitable in the specific way that wars are always profitable for the man who controls the logistics. The Cotton Road ran for 3 active years before Union forces reached Brownsville. Dozens of wagon trains, each carrying between 200 and 300 bales of Confederate cotton, moved through King Ranch territory on their way to Matamoros, where King and Kennedy's Mexican-flagged vessels waited. The cotton floated 40 miles south to Baghdad at the river's mouth, transferring to ocean steamers bound for Liverpool and Le Havre. The return voyages brought military supplies, medicines, uniforms, and shoes the Confederacy couldn't manufacture in sufficient quantity. At peak operation, the firm ran between 6 and 8 vessels simultaneously on the lower river. Confederate contracts for beef, horses, and transport ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars over the conflict's duration. The cotton trade added more. A conservative estimate of King's combined wartime net profit, contracts plus trade, 4 years, both directions, places the figure at between $250,000 and $500,000 in 1865 money against land still selling at 3 to 5 cents per acre along the Nueces. The capital available for land purchase after the war was of a different order than anything King had held before. What the wartime account contains and what it does not contain are both worth noting. It contains a man who ran a blockade under false registry, supplied a government fighting to preserve slavery, and earned a fortune from the transaction. It does not contain Francisco Alvarado's age, how long he had worked at Santa Gertrudis, or whether he had a family on the compound. The historical record lists him once and moves on. He is the only person at Santa Gertrudis who died in the Civil War, and he died defending a house whose owner had already escaped. King came back. He had his amnesty, his money, and a clear sense of what the war had opened. The northern markets needed beef. The trail drives hadn't started yet. He had tens of thousands of longhorns on the Santa Gertrudis that could be purchased for $5 per head and sold in Kansas City for $40. The numbers were finally what he needed them to be. Chapter 7. The Running W. The math of the post-war cattle market were simple enough that even a steamboat captain could see them immediately. Texas Longhorns sold for $5 a head south of the Red River. The same animal, delivered to a Kansas City stockyard, sold for $40. The difference was 1,000 miles of trail drive through contested country, river crossings, Indian territory, summer heat, the constant threat of stampede. That difference was also the entire margin of the cattle industry for the next 20 years. Every man who drove north understood the math. Richard King had more cattle than anyone else, and after 4 years of wartime contracts, more capital to execute the drive at scale. In 1869, he registered a brand, the Running W, a serpentine figure pressed into hide that couldn't be altered without making the alteration obvious. Not an initial, not a simple geometric mark. A shape designed to be unforgeable. He burned it into every animal on the Santa Gertrudis. Between 1869 and 1884, King sent more than 100,000 head of livestock north on the trail drives. The operation required a specific arithmetic of men, horses, supplies, and time. Each drive crew numbered between 8 and 12 cowboys for a herd of 2,000 to 3,000 head, with a trail boss, a cook, a wrangler managing the remuda, and enough experienced riders to maintain the herd in columns during the day and prevent stampede at night. The drives ran 12 to 16 weeks from Santa Gertrudis to the Kansas railheads at Ellsworth or Wichita, covering between 12 and 15 miles per day in good conditions, less when weather, river crossings, or Indian encounters intervened. Each crew left the ranch with a chuck wagon carrying 400 pounds of provisions, flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, dried fruit, enough to cover the drive with a small reserve. The remuda ran 8 to 10 horses per rider, rotated daily to prevent exhaustion. Trail mortality. Among the cattle averaged 3 to 5% on a clean drive, higher in wet years when rivers ran full or dry years when waterholes disappeared between the Nueces and the Cimarron. A single season's drives from Santa Gertrudis dispatched 8 to 12 such crews simultaneously from different starting points, coordinated from the headquarters by men who had to account for grass conditions, water availability, and market timing without the benefit of telegraph communication that reached more than a few fixed points along the route. King managed this from the ranch and from his offices in Corpus Christi and Brownsville, relying on trail bosses whose judgment he had tested over years. The fence came alongside the drives, and it was in some ways more consequential. King had erected 500 miles of board fencing by the late 1860s, converting open range that had previously been communal, that neighboring ranchers had watered their cattle on, that Mexican families had grazed their animals across, into the private property of the man who had arrived with river money and lawyers. This was not illegal. The law as it existed in South Texas in the 1860s supported it, but the effect was specific. Families who had ranched the adjacent land for generations suddenly found waterholes and grazing ground behind fences they hadn't built. Some sold to King at prices that reflected their reduced options. Some held on, some left. Then came barbed wire. First patented in 1874, widely available by the end of the decade. A single strand of barbed wire cost a fraction of a board fence to install and did the same job. King replaced board fencing with wire as fast as he could run it and pushed the line outward with each replacement. The fence was not just a boundary, it was an argument, made in steel wire and wooden posts about who owned the country. Over 60 major land transactions between 1853 and his death in 1885. Purchases from discouraged neighbors selling cheap in the drought years of the late 70s. Purchases from Mexican grant heirs navigating courts that had not been built to help them. Purchases that Henrietta and Kleberg would continue after King was gone until the original 68,000 acres, 107 sections, had become 614,959 sections, covering 6 South Texas counties. Robert E. Lee had told him to buy land and never sell. King followed this instruction with one exception. He sold a strip of right-of-way through Santa Gertrudis to help a railroad come south. He understood that the railroad would do what the trail drives had always required people to do, move cattle north to market at a fraction of the cost and with none of the mortality. When the railroad came, the trail drive era ended. King had used the drives to accumulate capital and reputation for 20 years, and he was prepared to hand the work off to a machine the moment the machine was available. He had built something that required more than the word ranch to describe. A territory, a system, a name that appeared on more cattle in the northern stockyards than any other mark in any other region by any other operator. The Running W, a brand designed to last. The question was whether the man who had designed it would last long enough to see what it would actually become. Chapter 8. The Patron and His People. At the center of the Santa Gertrudis compound stood the big house. 2 stories of lime-plastered brick, thick-walled against the heat, its long verandas running the length of the front and sides. The rooms opened onto interior courtyards in the Mexican hacienda tradition. Inside, wooden floors, real glass in the windows, a dining table that seated 12, gasoliers imported from the east. Outside, within the compound walls, workers' quarters, a school, a chapel, a blacksmith shop, a commissary, corrals, a smokehouse, a well, a wash-house, storage buildings for grain and equipment. The whole arrangement covered several acres and housed, at any given time, between 100 and 150 people. This was not a ranch in the ordinary sense. It was a settlement organized around a single family's authority. King had not invented the structure. He had imported it from the hacienda tradition that Spanish colonial authorities had formalized across Mexico over 3 centuries, in which the landowner provided housing, food, employment, and protection to workers who lived on the property and owed their economic survival to its continued operation. The patron owned the land. The peonies worked it. The transaction was presented as mutual benefit, and in the most basic sense it was. The workers ate, and the landowner prospered. What was not discussed was the architecture of the arrangement, which made every benefit conditional on continued presence and continued labor, and which made departure not illegal, but practically impossible. The commissary sat near the center of the compound. Workers received wages. Real wages, not tokens, but the commissary extended credit against those wages, and the credit covered everything a family needed that the ranch did not provide directly: dry goods, clothing, tools, the occasional luxury. A worker who arrived with debt left with debt. A worker whose family accumulated credit at the commissary was, in a functional sense, attached to the compound by something stronger than a contract. Contracts could be broken. Debt followed you. The Kineños, for their part, built something on Santa Gertrudis that the official record acknowledges with genuine respect. They developed a style of cattle work specific to the South Texas brush country, close-quarters horsemanship, the ability to work cattle through mesquite and huisache that would stop an Anglo cowboy cold. a knowledge of the land so detailed that they could locate water in drought conditions that killed other men's herds. This expertise was not transferable in the abstract. It lived in the hands and eyes of men who had worked that specific ground, those specific animals, in that specific heat, for years. King Ranch, without the Kineños, was an acreage and a brand. The Kineños were the knowledge that made the brand mean something. The school Henrietta organized taught the children to read in English and Spanish. The chapel provided religious structure. The housing, basic but permanent, was better than what many rural Mexican families had on their own land in Tamaulipas. These were not nothing. They were real. They were also the instruments by which a complete life could be built inside the compound without requiring anything from the outside world, which was the point. The social grammar of the arrangement had a name. Scholars who have examined it in detail use the word feudal without embarrassment. One research account puts it plainly. King's way of life was a revival of feudalism in the 19th century Wild West, with his workers dependent on his patronage, much as serfs in the Middle Ages had relied on the lords in the manor houses. The comparison is not hostile. It is structural. The relationship between King and the Kineños operated on the same logic as the relationship between a medieval lord and his village, labor and loyalty in exchange for protection and provision, both parties bound to the same land by different kinds of necessity. King moved through this arrangement with the confidence of a man who had built something and believed that building it was sufficient justification for how it was built. He was paternalistic in the full weight of the word, attentive to the welfare of the people on his land in ways that expressed genuine care, and completely certain that he knew what that welfare required better than they did. He called them his people. He meant it sincerely. The word people contains the whole problem. It establishes belonging without establishing standing, affection without autonomy. The Kineños, for generations, accepted the arrangement or had no alternative to accepting it. They built Santa Gertrudis with their hands and their knowledge, year after year, decade after decade. They are described in the ranch's own history as indispensable. They named nothing. They owned nothing. When King died, the land passed to his widow and then to his son-in-law, and the Kineños passed with it, not as property, not as slaves, but as the permanent human infrastructure of an empire they would never inherit. In 1881, a young lawyer from Corpus Christi walked into a courtroom and won an argument against Richard King on the question of property rights. King should have been furious. Instead, he walked out of the courthouse, found the lawyer, and tried to hire him on the spot. He succeeded. The man's name was Robert Kleberg. Within 4 years, he would be running the ranch. Chapter 9. Not a Foot. The Courtroom in Corpus Christi, 1881. Richard King sat on the wrong side of a property argument, facing a lawyer 30 years his junior who had studied law at the University of Virginia and arrived in South Texas with his father's reputation and his own ambition. Robert Eustace Kleberg was stocky, ruddy-complexioned, with a bushy mustache and a precision of argument that King, who had spent 30 years instructing lawyers rather than being instructed by them, had not encountered across a courtroom before. Kleberg won. King's response was immediate and characteristic. He approached Kleberg after the verdict and offered him a job, not as an adversary to be neutralized, but as an asset to be acquired. "Young man," King told him, "the only thing I want to hear from you is when I can move my fences." Kleberg accepted. Within months, he was handling the legal affairs of the Santa Gertrudis. Within years, he was visiting the ranch house regularly enough to notice King's youngest daughter, Alice Gertrudis, named for the creek the ranch was built on. King noticed him noticing. He said nothing against it. By 1883, King's body was failing in ways that the wild horse desert couldn't fix. Stomach cancer. It moved slowly at first, a persistent discomfort, a loss of appetite, a thinning that people around him attributed to work and weather before they had to admit what it was. The man who had crossed the Rio Grande on a surplus army steamboat with nothing, who had built a river monopoly from smuggled goods and military contracts, who had accumulated 614,000 acres, 959 sections, through 60-plus transactions conducted at pennies per acre, that man was losing weight he couldn't recover, and everyone close to him could see it. He kept working. The fence lines kept moving. The cattle drives continued north. He was at the ranch as much as his body permitted, and when it didn't permit, he managed from Corpus Christi or Brownsville, dictating correspondence, signing documents, pressing his lawyers for title confirmations on the next parcel he wanted. The obsession that had organized his life since 1853, more land, cleaner title, the fences moved outward, didn't slow with his body. It continued until his body stopped. In 1885, he left Santa Gertrudis for San Antonio to see his doctor. Everyone at the ranch knew he would not be coming back. The man who had arrived on horseback, or by buckboard, or driving cattle north through the brush, that man had to be helped to his stagecoach. His hair and beard had gone gray. His complexion was ashen. He had lived hard on a hard piece of ground for 32 years, and the accounting was visible. He checked into the Menger Hotel on Alamo Plaza, next door to the building where a different kind of Texas history had ended 50 years earlier. On April 14th, 1885, at dusk, Richard King died. He was 60 years old. His estate was documented with the precision he had always brought to transactions. Real estate valued at $564,784. Livestock and other property at $496,700. Total assets, $1,061,484, roughly $37 million today. Debts of $500,000, almost exactly half the asset value, or about $17.5 million by current measure. He had been buying land until he ran out of time to buy it, and the buying had outpaced the paying. He left everything to Henrietta. His last instruction to his lawyer was brief, characteristic. Not to let a foot of dear old Santa Gertrudis get away from us. Not the cattle, not the revenue, not the brand or the contracts or the cattle drives still running north to Kansas. The land. In the end, everything else was instrumental. The river operation, the wartime profits, the drives, the fences, all of it had been in service of the ground itself. 68,000 acres in 1854. 614,959 sections at his death. The instruction was not sentimental. It was the last expression of the only principle that had organized his adult life. Land increased in value, and boats decayed. Henrietta was 52 years old. She had 500,000 acres, $500,000 in debt, 5 children, and 1 instruction. She followed it. Chapter 10. The Widow's Ranch. Robert Clayburgh married Alice Gertrudis King in June of 1886, 14 months after her father's death. The ceremony was modest, the inheritance was not. He moved into the ranch house at Santa Gertrudis and took up residence directly across the hall from Henrietta King. That arrangement, mother-in-law on one side of the corridor, the young couple on the other, would not change for decades. When the original frame house burned in 1912, the custom carried over into the grand hacienda that replaced it. Henrietta presided at the dinner table, She offered counsel on the children. She was present at every significant decision the ranch made until her death in 1925, at which point Kleberg had been running her husband's empire for 40 years and was himself approaching the end of his strength. He never had a life of his own. That was the price of the inheritance. What Kleberg walked into in 1885 was not a functioning empire. It was the wreckage of one man's ambition, imperfectly disguised as a going concern. Cattle prices had collapsed from $40 a head to $5. The trail drives were over, the Kansas railheads were glutted, the open range was closing, and the economics that had made the drives viable for 20 years had shifted permanently. Drought had settled over South Texas and would not lift for nearly a decade. King's relentless buying had put the ranch so deeply in debt that its assets and liabilities were roughly equal. One bad season could tip it into insolvency. Kleberg made one decision that violated King's founding instruction. He sold land, 20,000 acres of it, to generate the cash to stabilize the debt. Then he stopped selling and started the long work of paying what remained. By 1896, the debt was gone. The ranch held 650,000 acres, 1,015 sections. 34,000 calves were branded annually. Kleberg did this by doing what King never was trained to do, managing the operation with scientific precision rather than frontier instinct. He hired a professional livestock manager. He built the first cattle dipping vat in South Texas to combat tick fever, inventing the mechanism himself. He began systematic crossbreeding, importing shorthorn bulls from England to improve the quality of the longhorn herds. He kept records. He tracked bloodlines. He approached the land the way King approached the river monopoly, as a system that could be optimized, not just exploited. The water problem was the oldest problem on the Santa Gertrudis. Surface water in South Texas was seasonal and unreliable. The creek ran low in drought years. The water holes dried. Cattle died of thirst at the same time the grass was failing. In 1898, Kleberg hired a man named Theodore Herring and gave him a specific assignment: find the water that had to be there under the ground, somewhere below the dry surface. On August 5, 1899, drilling equipment broke through a geological layer at depth, and water came up under its own pressure. Artesian, the first artesian well in South Texas. The water that rose from that hole eventually supplied the entire headquarters compound and changed what the ranch could sustain. The artesian well made something else possible: the railroad. Kleberg had been negotiating for years with the St. Louis, Brownsville, and Mexico Railway about a line through South Texas. The railroad needed to know there was water along the route, water for the locomotives, water for any town that might develop along the line. The artesian well was the answer. In 1904, the railroad came through. Henrietta and Kleberg rode out to a point on the prairie and chose a site along the right-of-way. He helped her dismount. "Here," he said, according to the family account, "we will build our town." They built it. Streets, houses, banks, schools, churches, a cotton gin, a compress, a newspaper. The town was named Kingsville, and it was Henrietta who drove its development, donating land for a school that became Texas A&M University, Kingsville, funding churches and hospitals, organizing the civic infrastructure with the same methodical attention she had brought to the ranch compound for 50 years. By the time the railroad was running, Kingsville was a functioning South Texas town with a future that did not depend entirely on cattle. The ranch kept growing. Kleberg bought the Laureles division, extending the Santa Gertrudis holdings east to the Laguna Madre. He bought the Norias and Encino divisions, pushing the total acreage past the figures King had accumulated. The debt King had died with was memory. The land King had instructed him to hold was larger than King had left it. Henrietta King died on March 31st, 1925, in the house on Santa Gertrudis that had been her home for 70 years. She was 92. The ranch had grown from 600,000 acres she inherited to 1,200,000 acres, 1,875 sections. By any measure of the instruction her husband had left, she had followed it. Her funeral was a specific kind of ceremony. 200 Kineño vaqueros, mounted on quarter horses, branded with the running W, flanked the hearse as it traveled to the burial site. At the grave, each rider cantered once around the open hole and kept moving. 200 men riding in formation around the grave of the woman who had organized their world for half a century. The horses were branded with her husband's mark. The riders were the descendants of the people her husband had recruited from a drought-struck village in Tamaulipas 70 years before. They were still called King's people. The instruction had been followed. Not a foot had gotten away. Epilogue: What the ground held. In 1933, with the Great Depression pressing the ranch toward insolvency and cattle prices collapsed for the second time in 2 generations, Robert Kleberg Jr. signed a lease with Humble Oil and Refining Company. The terms: $127,824 per year plus a 1/8 royalty on production, covering the right to explore beneath 825,000 acres, 1,289 sections of South Texas. The ground King had bought at 2 cents per acre, which Henrietta had held through drought and debt, which Kleberg had expanded through systematic acquisition across 40 years. That ground held something nobody had thought to drill for in 1853. By the time Exxon's successor operations reached their peak in the 1980s, the drilling revenues to King Ranch approached $100 million. 3,700 wells, the same land, a different resource. The Santa Gertrudis cattle breed was certified in 1940 as the first new American beef cattle breed recognized in over a century. Brahman bulls crossed with British shorthorns, the combination that produced animals capable of gaining weight on poor forage, in punishing heat, resistant to the ticks that had killed longhorns by the thousands every season. Richard King had understood that the Gulf Coast cattle market needed this animal. He had said so repeatedly. He had not lived to see it. The breed that solved the problem he spent 30 years identifying was developed by the generation after him, perfected over 3 decades of careful crossing, and named for the creek that ran through the ground he bought in 1853 for $300. Today, the ranch covers 825,000 acres, 1,289 sections, across 6 South Texas counties, larger than Rhode Island, still under single-family ownership. The Kineños' descendants still live and work there, families whose great-grandparents made the journey north from Cruillas with King's cattle, who built the expertise that every subsequent operation depended on, who have never owned the land they shaped across 5 generations. The ranch calls them indispensable. The word has not changed in 170 years. The cotton road that funded his first land purchases is invisible now. The Kineños, whose horsemanship made the cattle drives possible, are mostly unnamed in the historical record. Francisco Alvarado, who died trying to protect the house, appears in 1 sentence and nowhere else. The Mexican families who sold their Spanish land grants for 3 cents an acre. Their names are in title documents in county courthouses, available to anyone who looks, read by almost no one. The running W is still burned into cattle on Santa Gertrudis. The brand King, designed to be unforgeable, has held for 155 years. The instruction he gave from his deathbed, not a foot, not 1 foot, was followed by his wife for 40 years, and by her son-in-law for 40 more, and by their children after that. He came from New York with no name and no money. He built the largest ranch under single-family ownership in the United States. He did it with smuggled goods, wartime profits, land purchased at crisis prices from people with no leverage, and a workforce recruited from a village whose cattle he had purchased on the way out. Their descendants still work the land. They are still called King's people. Whether that is a legacy or a verdict depends entirely on where you are standing when you look at it. If this story left you with more questions than answers, that's where the interesting ones always begin. Tell us what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, there are dozens of them waiting just below the surface of the official history. Subscribe, and we will keep finding them.